This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kelsey Molyneux. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 5, Part 1. It was the Major's turn to entertain his friend, and by 9:30, on a certain squally October evening, he and Puffin were seated by the fire in the diary room, while the rain volleyed at the windows and occasional puffs of stinging smoke were driven down the chimney by the gale that squealed and buffeted round the house. Puffin, by way of keeping up the comedy of Roman roads, had brought a map of the district across from his house, but the more essential part of his equipment for the studious evening was a bottle of whiskey. Originally the host had provided whiskey for himself and his guest at these pleasant chats, but there were undeniable objections to this plan, because the guest always proved unusually thirsty, which tempted his host to keep pace with him, while if they both drank at their own expense, the causes of economy and abstemiousness had a better chance. Also, while the Major took his drinks short and strong in a tumbler, Puffin enriched his with lemons and sugar in a large one, so that nobody could really tell if equality as well as fraternity was realized, but if each brought his own bottle. It had been a trying day, and the Major was very lame. A drenching storm had come up during their golf, while they were far from the clubhouse, and Puffin, being 3 up, had naturally refused to accede to his opponent's suggestion to call the match off. He was perfectly willing to be paid his half-crown and go home, but Major Flint, remembering that Puffin's game usually went to pieces if it rained, had rejected this proposal with the scorn that it deserved. There had been other disagreeable incidents as well. His driver, slippery from rain, had flown out of the Major's hands on the 12th tee, and had shot like a streamer of the northern morn, and landed in a pool of brackish water left by an unusually high tide. The ball had gone into another pool nearer the tree. The ground was greasy with moisture, and 3 holes farther on, Puffin had fallen flat on his face instead of lashing his 5th shot home onto the green, as he had intended. They had given each other stymies, and each had holed his opponent's ball by mistake. They had wrangled over the correct procedure if you lay in a rabbit scrape or on the tram lines. The Major had lost a new ball. There was a mushroom on one of the greens between Puffin's ball and the hole. All these untoward incidents had come crowding in together, and from the Major's point of view, the worst of them all had been the collective incident that Puffin, so far from being put off by the rain, had, in spite of mushroom and falling down, played with a steadiness of which he was usually quite incapable. Consequently, Major Flint was lame and his wound troubled him, while Puffin, in spite of his obvious reasons for complacency, was growing irritated with his companion's ill temper and was half blinded by wood smoke. He wiped his streaming eyes. "You should get your chimney swept," he observed. Major Flint had put his handkerchief over his face to keep the wood smoke out of his eyes. He blew it off with a loud, indignant puff. "Oh, ha! Indeed!" he said. Puffin was rather taken aback by the violence of these interjections. They dripped with angry sarcasm. "Oh, well, no offence," he said. "A man," said the Major impersonally, "makes an offensive remark, and says no offence. If your own fireside suits you better than mine, Captain Puffin, all I can say is that you are at liberty to enjoy it." This was all rather irregular. They had indulged in a good stiff breeze this afternoon, and it was too early to ruffle the calm again. Puffin plucked and proffered an olive branch. "There's your handkerchief," he said, picking it up. "Now let's have one of our comfortable talks. Hot glass of grog and a chat over the fire. That's the best thing after such a wetting as we got this afternoon. I'll take a slice of lemon, if you'll be so good as to give it to me, and a lump of sugar." The Major got up and limped to his cupboard. It struck him precisely at that moment that Puffin scored considerably over lemons and sugar, because he was supplied with them gratis every other night, whereas he himself, when Puffin's guest, took nothing off his host but hot water. He determined to ask for some biscuits anyhow, tomorrow. "I hardly know whether there's a lemon left," he grumbled. "I must lay in a store of lemons. As for sugar—" Puffin chose to disregard this suggestion. "Amusing incident the other day," he said brightly, "when Miss Mapp's cupboard door flew open. The old lady didn't like it. Don't suppose the poor of the parish will see much of that corned beef." The Major became dignified. "Pardon me," he said. "When an esteemed friend like Miss Elizabeth tells me that certain provisions are destined for the poor of the parish, I take it that her statement is correct. I expect others of my friends, while they are in my presence, to do the same. I have the honour to give you a lemon, Captain Puffin, and a slice of sugar. I should say a lump of sugar. Pray, make yourself comfortable." This dignified and lofty mood was often one of the after-effects of an unsuccessful game of golf. It generally yielded quite quickly to a little stimulant. Puffin filled his glass from the bottle and the kettle, while his friend put his handkerchief again over his face. "Well, I shall just have my grog before I turn in," he observed, according to custom. "Aren't you going to join me, Major?" "Presently, sir," said the Major. Puffin knocked out the consumed cinders in his pipe against the edge of the fender. Major Flint apparently was waiting for this, for he withdrew his handkerchief and closely watched the process. A minute piece of ash fell from Puffin's pipe onto the hearthrug, and he jumped to his feet and removed it very carefully with a shovel. "I have your permission, I hope," he said witheringly. "Certainly, certainly," said Puffin. "Now get your glass, Major. You'll feel better in a minute or two." Major Flint would have liked to have kept up this magnificent attitude, but the smell of Puffin's steaming glass beat dignity down, and after glaring at him, he limped back to the cupboard for his whiskey bottle. He gave a lamentable cry when he beheld it. "But I got that bottle in only the day before yesterday," he shouted, "and there's hardly a drink left in it." "Well, you did yourself pretty well last night," said Puffin. "Those small glasses of yours, if frequently filled up, empty a bottle quicker than you seem to realize." Motives of policy prevented the Major from receiving this with the resentment that was proper to it, and his face cleared. He would get quits over these incessant lemons and lumps of sugar. "Well, you'll have to let me borrow from you tonight," he said genially, as he poured the rest of the contents of his bottle into the glass. "Ah, that's more the ticket. A glass of whiskey a day keeps the doctor away." The prospect of sponging on Puffin was most exhilarating, and he put his large slippered feet on to the fender. "Yes, indeed, that was a highly amusing incident about Miss Mapp's cupboard," he said. "And wasn't Miss Plasto down on her like a knife about it? Our fair friends, you know, have a pretty sharp eye for each other's little failings. They've no sooner finished one squabble than they begin another, the pert little fairies. They can't sit and enjoy themselves like two old cronies I could tell you of, and feel at peace with all the world." He finished his glass at a gulp, and seemed much surprised to find it empty. "I'll be borrowing a drop from you, old friend," he said. "Help yourself, Major," said Puffin, with a keen eye as to how much he took. "Very obliging of you. I feel as if I caught a bit of a chill this afternoon. My wound." "Be careful not to inflame it," said Puffin. "Thank ye for the warning. It's this beastly climate that touches it up. A winter in England adds years onto a man's life unless he takes care of himself. Take care of yourself, old boy. Have some more sugar." Before long the Major's hand was moving slowly and instinctively towards Puffin's whiskey bottle again. "I reckon that big glass of yours, Puffin," he said, "holds between 3½ times to 4 times what my little tumbler holds. Between 3½ and 4, I should reckon. I may be wrong." "Reckoning the water in, I dare say you're not far out, Major," said he, "and according to my estimate you mix your drink somewhere about 3½ times to 4 stronger than I mix mine." "Oh, come, come," said the Major. 3½ to 4 times. "Ah, I should say," repeated Puffin. "You won't find I'm far out." He replenished his tumbler, and instead of putting the bottle back on the table, absently deposited it on the floor on the far side of his chair. This second tumbler usually marked the most convivial period of the evening, for the first would have healed whatever unhappy discords had marred the harmony of the day, and, those being disposed of, they very contentedly talked through their hats about past prowesses, and took a rosy view of the youth and energy which still beat in their vigorous pulses. They would begin, perhaps, by extolling each other. Puffin, when informed that his friend would be 54 next birthday, flatly refused, without offence, to believe it, and, indeed, he was quite right in doing so, because the Major was in reality 56. In turn, Major Flint would say that his friend had the figure of a boy of 20, which caused Puffin presently to feel a little cramped and to wander negligently in front of the big looking glass between the windows, and find this compliment much easier to swallow than the Major's age. For the next half hour they would chiefly talk about themselves in a pleasant glow of self-satisfaction. Major Flint, looking at the various implements and trophies that adorned the room, would suggest putting a sporting challenge in the Times. "'Pon my word, Puffin," he said, "I've half a mind to do it. Retired Major of His Majesty's Forces, the King, God bless him," and he took a substantial sip. "Retired Major, aged 54, challenges any gentleman of 50 years or over." 40, said Puffin sycophantically, as he thought over what he would say about himself when the old man had finished. "Well, we'll have it. We'll say 45, to please you, Puffin. Let's see, where had I got to? Retired major challenges any gentleman of 45 years or over to a shooting match in the morning, followed by half a dozen rounds with 4-ounce gloves, a game of golf, 18 holes, in the afternoon, and a billiards match of 200 up after tea. Ha ha! I shouldn't feel much anxiety as to the result. My confounded leg, said Puffin. But I know a retired captain from His Majesty's merchant service, the King, God bless him, aged 50. Ho ho! 50 indeed, said the major, thinking to himself that a dried-up little man like Puffin might be as old as an Egyptian mummy. Who can tell the age of a kipper? Not a day less, Major. Retired captain, aged 50, will take on all comers of 42 and over at a steeplechase, round of golf, billiards match, hopping match, gymnastic competition, swinging Italian clubs. No objection, gentlemen? Then carried mem. Con. This gaseous mood, athletic, amatory or otherwise, the amatory ones were the worst, usually faded slowly, like the light from the setting sun or an exhausted coal in the grate, about the end of Puffin's second tumbler, and the gentlemen after that were usually somnolent, but occasionally laid the foundation for some disagreement next day, which they were too sleepy to go into now. Major Flint, by this time, would have had some 5 small glasses of whiskey, equivalent, as he bitterly observed, to 1 in pre-war days, and as he measured his next with extreme care and a slightly jerky movement, would announce it as being his nightcap, though you would have thought he had plenty of nightcaps on already. Puffin correspondingly took a thimbleful more, the thimble apparently belonging to some housewife of Anak, and after another half-hour of sudden single snores and startings awake again, of pipes frequently lit and immediately going out, the guest, still perfectly capable of coherent speech and voluntary motion in the required direction, would stumble across the dark cobbles to his house, and doors would be very carefully closed for fear of attracting the attention of the old lady, who at this period of the evening was usually known as Old Mappy. The two were perfectly well aware of the sympathetic interest that Old Mappy took in all that concerned them, and that she had an eye on their evening seances was evidenced by the frequency with which the corner of her blind in the window of the garden-room was raised between, say, 9:30 and 11 at night. They had often watched with giggles the pencil of light that escaped, obscured at the lower end by the outline of Old Mappy's head, and occasionally drank to the guardian angel. Guardian Angel, in answer to direct inquiries, had been told by Major Benjy during the last month that he worked at his diaries on 3 nights in the week, and went to bed early on the others, to the vast improvement of his mental grasp. "And on Saturday night, dear Major Benjy?" asked Old Mappy in the character of Guardian Angel. "I don't think you knew my beloved, my reverend mother, Miss Elizabeth," said Major Benjy. "I spend Sunday evening well. The very next Sunday evening Guardian Angel had heard the sounds of singing. She could not catch the words, and only fragments of the tune, which reminded her of "The roseate morn hath passed away." Brimming with emotion, she sang it softly to herself as she undressed, and blamed herself very much for ever having thought that dear Major Benjy. She peeped out of her window when she had extinguished her light, but fortunately the singing had ceased. To-night, however, the epoch of Puffin's second big tumbler was not accompanied by harmonious developments. Major Benjy was determined to make the most of this unique opportunity of drinking his friend's whiskey, and whether Puffin put the bottle on the farther side of him, or under his chair, or under the table, he came padding round in his slippers and standing near the ambush while he tried to interest his friend in the tales of love or tiger, shooting so as to distract his attention. When he mistakenly thought he had done so, he hastily refilled his glass, taking unusually stiff doses for fear of not getting another opportunity, and altogether omitting to ask Puffin's leave for these maraudings. When this had happened 4 or 5 times, Puffin, acting on the instinct of the polar bear who eats her babies for fear that anybody else should get them, surreptitiously poured the rest of his bottle into his glass, and filled it up to the top with hot water, making a mixture of extraordinary power. Soon after this Major Flint came rambling around the table again. He was not sure whether Puffin had put the bottle by his chair or behind the coal scuttle, and was quite ignorant of the fact that wherever it was empty. Amorous reminiscences to-night had been the accompaniment to Puffin's second tumbler. "Devilish fine woman she was," he said, "and that was the last Benjamin Flint ever saw of her. She went up to the hills next morning." "But the last you saw of her just now was on the deck of the P. and O. at Bombay," objected Puffin. "Or did she go up to the hills on the deck of the P. and O.? Wonderful line." "No, sir," said Benjamin Flint, "that was Helen. La belle Hélène. It was La belle Hélène whom I saw off at the Apollo Bunder. I don't know if I told you. By gad, I've kicked the bottle over. No idea you'd put it there. Hope the cork's in."
"No harm if it isn't," said Puffin, beginning on his third most fiery glass. The strength of it rather astonished him. "You don't mean to say it's empty?" asked Major Flint. "Why, just now there was close on a quarter of a bottle left." "As much as that?" asked Puffin. "Glad to hear it." "Not a drop less. You don't mean to say, well, if you can drink that and can say hippopotamus afterwards, I should put that among your challenges to men of 402, I should say 42. It's a fine thing to have a strong head, though if I drank what you've got in your glass, I should be tipsy, sir." Puffin laughed in his irritating falsetto manner. "Good thing that it's in my glass, then, and not your glass," he said. "And let me tell you, Major, in case you don't know it, that when I've drunk every drop of this and sucked the lemon, you'll have had far more out of my bottle this evening than I have. My usual twice, and my usual nightcap, as you say, is what's my ration, and I've had no more than my ration, 8 bells." "And a pretty good ration you've got there," said the baffled Major, "without your usual twice." Puffin was beginning to be aware of that as he swallowed the fiery mixture, but nothing in the world would now have prevented his drinking every single drop of it. It was clear to him, among so much that was dim owing to the wood smoke, that the Major would miss a good many drives tomorrow morning. "And whose whiskey is it?" he said, gulping down the fiery stuff. "I know whose it's going to be," said the other. "And I know whose it is now," retorted Puffin. "And I know whose whiskey it is that's filled you up tight as a drum," he repeated very carefully. Major Flint was conscious of an unusual activity of brain, and, when he spoke, of a sort of congestion and entanglement of words. It pleased him to think that he had drunk so much of somebody else's whiskey, but he felt that he ought to be angry. "That's a very unmentionable sort of thing to say," he remarked, "and if it wasn't for the sacred claims of hospitality, I'd make you explain just what you mean by that, and make you eat your words. 'Pologize, in fact." Puffin finished his glass at a gulp, and rose to his feet. "'Pologies be blowed," he said. "Hittopopamus." "And you were addressing that to me?" asked Major Flint with deadly calm. "Of course I was. Same animal as before. Pleasant old boy. And as for the lemon you lent me, well, I don't want it any more. Have a suck at it, old fellow. I don't want it any more." The Major turned purple in the face, made a course for the door, like a knight's move at chess, a long step in one direction and a short one at right angles to the first, and opened it. The door thus served as an aperture from the room and a support to himself. He spoke no word of any sort of kind. His silence spoke for him in a far more dignified manner than he could have managed for himself. Captain Puffin stood for a moment wreathed in smiles, and fingering the slice of lemon which he had meant playfully to throw at his friend. But his smile faded, and by some sort of telepathic perception he realized how much more decorous it was to say, or better, to indicate, good night in a dignified manner than to throw lemons about. He walked in dots and dashes like a Morse code out of the room, bestowing a naval salute on the Major as he passed. The latter returned it with a military salute and a suppressed hiccup. Not a word passed. Then Captain Puffin found his hat and coat without much difficulty, and marched out of the house, slamming the door behind him with a bang that echoed down the street and made Miss Mapp dream about a thunderstorm. He let himself into his own house, and bent down before his expired fire, which he tried to blow into life again. This was unsuccessful, and he breathed in a quantity of wood ash. He sat down by his table and began to think things out. He told himself that he was not drunk at all, but that he had taken an unusual quantity of whiskey, which seemed to produce much the same effect as intoxication. Allowing for that, he was conscious that he was extremely angry about something, and had a firm idea that the Major was very angry too. "But what's it all been about?" he vainly asked himself. "What's it all been about?" He was roused from his puzzling over this unanswerable conundrum by the clink of the flap in his letter box. Either this was the first post in the morning, in which case it was much later than he had thought, and wonderfully still dark, or it was the last post at night, in which case it was much earlier than he thought. But, whichever it was, a letter had been slipped into his box, and he brought it in. The gum on the envelope was still wet, which saved trouble in opening it. Inside was a half-sheet, containing but a few words. This curt epistle ran as follows: "Sir, my seconds will wait on you in the course of tomorrow morning. Your faithful, obedient servant, Benjamin Flint, Captain Puffin." Puffin felt as calm as a tropic night, and as courageous as a captain. Somewhere below his courage and his calm was an appalling sense of misgiving. That he successfully stifled. "Very proper," he said. "Quite proper. Insults, blood, seconds won't have to wait a second. Better get a good sleep." He went up to his room, fell into his bed, and instantly began to snore.
End of Chapter 5, Part 1.